Hello everyone. You're welcome to this week's Tech Tuesdays webinars on MDM workflow management using ActiveVOS. I'm Vrinda and I'll be hosting today's webinar. The presenter for today's session is Kunal Pandit, who is a Principal Support Engineer with Informatica's Global Customer Support. He has worked across multiple domains for MDM implementation and has around 13 years of experience with MDM suite of products. Before we start off, here are some housekeeping tips. This webinar will be for 1 hour that includes a 45 minutes webcast, and then we'll move over to live for 15 minutes to answer your questions. You can post your questions in the Q&A box and we'll try and answer them. All dial-in participants will be muted so that the presenter will be able to present without any kind of interruptions. The session is recorded and will be available to you in the Success portal and the YouTube channel. Also, put in your feedbacks and suggestions for the upcoming topics for our Tech Tuesdays webinars. The Tech Tuesday webinar is a webinar series introduced within the Success portal. The Informatica Success portal is a micro-learning platform that offers free and unlimited learning to all registered users. The Success portal lists your success offerings, your customer success manager information, bookings available in the Ask an Expert session, and you will also get to know the customized recommendation and content. Here are some important links that you can get back later for your product adoption journey. Over to you, Kunal. Thank you.
Thanks, Vrinda. Greetings, everyone. Today's session is MDM workflow management using ActiveVOS, which is currently the only supported task or BPM engine with MDM. We have a lot to cover today, so let's dive in. Moving on to the agenda for today, it will include an ActiveVOS overview, and we'll try to quickly go through the MDM and ActiveVOS setup basics. We'll walk you through on the ActiveVOS and MDM task flows in terms of create and list task. We'll also quickly go through the task configuration and management in MDM 10.4, which we'll also be covering in the demo today. We'll follow through with some best practices and ActiveVOS key tables that you can use to look for data. And we'll provide you a list of resources that you can take forward as well, and then we will open up for Q&A. So starting with ActiveVOS overview, right? So ActiveVOS is a business process management tool. It's basically based on an industry standard, which is a business process execution language. It works on the concept of write and deploy. So an ActiveVOS IDE based on Eclipse basically helps you write people code that you can then deploy on an ActiveVOS server, right? So if you come from a Java background, or if you have a basic understanding of Java, right? So it's like writing up the Java code and then preparing it to deploy on a server in terms of jar and ER files, right? So similarly for people code, you write using an ActiveVOS designer, and then you basically kind of deploy it in the form of a business process archive file on an ActiveVOS server, from after which it is available to kind of work between. After which it is basically there to kind of integrate the people within your organization with the IT systems, and then based on whatever business processes you need to follow, right? As far as the MDM use case is concerned, so it's primarily used for the human task getting created and reviewed for an entity onboarding or an edit of an entity, merge and unmerge scenarios where you want to validate whether a merge is acceptable or not. And then hierarchy review has been introduced with MDM 10.4. As I mentioned earlier, right, ActiveVOS Designer can be used to create custom workflows. So it's can not only provide you with workflows specific for MDM, you can even use a standalone instance of ActiveVOS that you can use to integrate with your other applications as well. So as I was mentioning earlier, right, that you can use an ActiveVOS Designer, which has an Eclipse-based IDE to design and test your people processes, and then it has an inbuilt Tomcat engine on which you can simulate some of your code. Then basically using API and web services, you can deploy your code on the ActiveVOS servers, which supports JBoss, WebSphere, and WebLogic that also support the MDM application. Moving on to MDM workflow engine. So um, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, right, that BE ActiveVOS is currently the only supported engine for MDM. If you had been using ActiveVOS as a subject area workflow adapter, it has also been deprecated now. So if you're using the BE ActiveVOS workflows, right, we do provide out-of-the-box workflows that are part of the installation, the MDM installation as well. We ship out, workflows for merge and unmerge scenarios, hierarchy, and one-step, two-step, and update with optional approvals, right? However, if you have to kind of customize these workflows, you will need a separate designer license. However, however, please know that the Informatica ActiveVOS server engine is actually shipped out with as part of the MDM. So if you're an MDM customer, you by default get an ActiveVOS server license, but not a designer license. You can reach out to Informatica Shipping if you do not have the BPM option enabled in your license, or if you are looking for a designer license. Moving on to the user role setup, right? So if you are an MDM customer, you probably know that MDM ships out with the admin as the default username and password, but ActiveVOS as a product ships out with default roles. The primary roles that are used for an MDM integration are listed on screen, which basically helps, for human task retrieval and access for identity service and the access to the ActiveVOS console, right? So ActiveVOS for user authentication relies on your container. So if you are using JBoss, WebSphere, or WebLogic, we recommend to kind of create say an ActiveVOS admin user. You can create any user that you want, but you'll also need to kind of create all these 4 roles on the realm and then basically have that user assign all these 4 roles, right? So we for authorization purposes with MDM, we rely on the MDM identity service for human task purposes. So basically, if so when MDM users try to pull task from ActiveVOS, right, their authorization call, like what roles they have is actually relies on a call made from ActiveVOS to MDM to get their roles from the SAM setup itself. So these roles, right, are the same ones that should be registered as the potential owner of the task. With MDM 10.4, so these are kind of configurable. So these are configurable from provisioning in MDM 10.4, right? For 10.4, right, we you can define 3 type of users for task management. It's like business users, which are your typical roles within an organization, like data steward, manager, senior manager, etc. Then we have something called as task administration, which basically provides capabilities to the user to move tasks between users, right? Or business users. But what you need to know is any user who is defined as a task admin won't be able to work on task data or take any task actions. So the other concept that we are covering is the concept of identity service, right? As I mentioned in the previous slide, that identity service provides ActiveVOS to authorize the roles of the users against the MDM SAM. So what happens? We will be covering we will cover in a couple of slides on how MDM identity service is used to authorize users, but it is something that should be installed by default uh, on during the installation process, and it basically relies on the MDM admin user password to be registered. If you use an external authentication system like LDAP, we still do recommend that you use MDM as your identity service provider for authorization purposes, because you don't want to kind of maintain the user role mapping for human tasks in two different places. Moving on to the concept of URN mappings, right? So URN is a pretty generic term which is used for instead of URLs. How URNs do help is it basically allows for portability of code between environments, right? So, for example, if you look at the screenshot, a URN mapping of URN MDM service. So this is something which is hard coded in your people process, right? What this does, it helps to resolve the URN to a particular URL in real time during the code execution process, right? So if you've got a dev, QA, and prod environment, which will have different endpoints for your B service, CIF service, or other APIs, right? Or even for database JNDIs, uh, you can just code the URN in your Beeple code, and during runtime, the ActiveVOS server basically will resolve this URN to the URL, right? So the sample workflows, right, as I mentioned, will rely on the URN mappings which are registered as part of the installation process. So this is primarily used, for the API calls that are made back to MDM, like after an entity has been approved or rejected, to execute, promote, and delete API calls back to MDM, or during or if a merge has been approved, then the execute merge API as well. So moving on we'll show you how conceptually how the task flows happen between an MDM. Between an MDM and the ActiveVOS application. So to start with, right, if your business users they log into MDM, right, and they basically either save an entity or in terms of creation or edit of an entity, what it does, it basically triggers a create task API in the backend. The MDM BPM adapter basically converts the create task API into a format which brings in into a start request format, which is the ingestion point for the ActiveVOS process, right? We'll be covering more of this in the demo, but basically what create task API does, it prepares the task data into a format in which ActiveVOS will accept. So once this is done, right, and the call, the start request is basically sent to ActiveVOS, it instantiates a new process for that workflow, right? So the process ID that is then created is actually provided back to MDM. So in order to see this, if you have a match table entry, right, and a workflow and a process has been created for a particular match, you will see that the row ID task column has been populated back with this process ID. So after the process has been created, right, the workflow will proceed and initiate a human task. So the concept of the process and task is a little tricky to understand, right? So from ActiveVOS perspective, even the human task is a process, but it is categorized as a system process, right? So a parent process is the one that is actually triggered when you instantiate a new workflow. And then after the process basically kind of flows through the code and encounters a human task activity, that is when it will instantiate another process, which is a system process for that particular task. Then after the task is ready on the ActiveVOS side, right, it is basically then can be retrieved and consumed by users on the MDM side. Moving on to the list task flow, which is basically the retrieval of tasks back into MDM. So after a user logs in into MDM and goes to the task manager, right? What it does, it basically invokes a list task API. What it does, the from the BPM adapter basically converts it into a get task API for ActiveVOS, which is the ActiveVOS native API for retrieval of human task. So once the ActiveVOS receives the API call to provide the task for a particular user, right? What ActiveVOS will do, it will basically fire a get identity API, which relies on the MDM identity service to confirm what roles does a particular user has in MDM SAM setup, right? So if user DS1 basically logs in into MDM, and an API call is then instantiated for that particular user. ActiveVOS will receive that call, but it will still go ahead and check with MDM like what roles does it has, right? Whether it has got a data steward role, a manager role, or some other roles assigned as well, right? So if ActiveVOS does not return your task for the user, right, it basically means either it doesn't have the right privileges because the identity service did not find the relevant roles for that particular user, or the identity service test itself failed, right? Because probably the admin user in MDM, is not correctly registered on the identity service screen. Roles to ActiveVOS for that particular user. And once ActiveVOS matches the list of roles returned by MDM to the list of potential owners for the human task, right? Then it will basically go ahead and provide those tasks on the task manager for that particular user. So after that, any once the tasks are have been returned to MDM, right? Then basically all your data filters and your SAM setup comes into picture for providing access to the user based on the cell level configuration, the security configuration that you might have, right? So if you have enabled data filters where a US based data steward can only see US based data. So that is, kind of happens after the task has been brought in and associates the entity data with that particular task, right? So moving on to the next couple of slides, which we'll be covering during a demo as well. So we can quickly skim through these is the key concepts during task configuration, right? So these include task triggers, like on what events do you want to kind of create a task, like whether on a create BE or a merge BE, and what tasks will get initiated for that. And then for a particular task type, like for what roles you want it to happen, right? So that definition is defined during the task type. Then task templates is another component during the task configuration phase where you can define the task title, priority, due date, and other properties, and then basically mapping of the task admin role. So this is something which has been introduced in MDM 10.4, where a user who is mapped to your task admin role will be able to kind of claim task that has been associated by other that has already been claimed by other users and release it to other users to work on, right? One best practice is always to baseline your configuration with the provisioning guide or the MDM sample. Uh, what MDM sample does, it has a configuration that is already working, right? So you will have to spend less time troubleshooting a new setup, right? And you can just straight away import it and start customizing. We'll quickly move on to a brief agenda that we'll cover during our task management demo. We'll show, the capabilities in terms of bulk actions related to task and a bunch of operations like creating and listing of task, and then claim and disclaim options. We'll give you a quick overview of the edit and the task actions as well. So let's move on to the demo piece of this presentation. So before we begin the demo, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of the user and role setup that we'll be using. So we have DS1 and 2 as data stewards, and manager 1 and 2 as managers, and similarly for senior managers, right? And then we have one admin user, which is basically a common user across all the three roles. Then we have tadmin, which we have provided AB admin, the two roles, and it will act as a task administrator. Moving on to provisioning. So the purpose of this demo, we'll be using MDM sample schema. Beginning with the provisioning tool, right? We will try to go to the task configuration, right? So here are the four task configuration items that we talked about: templates, task types, triggers, and administration role. Right. So beginning with templates, which is pretty easy to configure, is just that you define a particular template, which can even just be a test template. So you kind of define what it should look like, what kind of label or title you want to define with that particular task type, a normal due date, uh, the normal priority, any default comments that you want to define, and currently open is the default status with which you want to kind of create the task templates, right? So if so we can use these templates with other task types. I'll remove this for now. So starting with the task type configuration, right? You can kind of similarly, you can kind of create a new task type here. For example, the A was B final review and give a label to it. Then whether you want to kind of enable file attachments and the task details or not. So this is like the master switch that you want attachments to be associated with the task actions and triggers for a particular task type. Right. So then once a task type has been defined, right, you can associate different roles for that particular task type. What should happen with the senior manager or a data steward, and like for which particular role, which entity or which hierarchy will have this task type associated with them. So for example, we define a person for the data steward, we define a person business entity, and we kind of just select it. If I have to add and associate another entity like an organization, I can pick and choose the list of entities here. Right. So similarly, you can map the different hierarchies which are available onto a map. The next thing you want to configure is the task action configuration. So this just talks about if it's a disclaim or an approved task action, whether the user will see a prompt for associating an attachment or a comment for that, right? Whether it's an optional, mandatory, or required. So for example, if a user is disclaiming a task, right, you want to make it mandatory for user to require a comment, whereas for another task type, maybe like claim, for like approve, you do not need to provide him with a task with right. You don't want to kind of provide any comments because an approval means an approval, right? So I'll just go ahead and discard these changes, and we'll try to move on to the task trigger configuration, right? So by default, these are the five task triggers that are available in the MDM sample schema, right? So at the trigger level is what all kind of comes together, where like you can pick and choose the template you want to be associated with a particular trigger, what will be the task type that will be initiated uh, when an event is triggered, and then whether it's a review task and unmerge, hierarchies and merge. So this is used when a task is open, what kind of screen it should go to, right? If it's a merge task, it should open up in a merge screen. A review task should open up in a data or in E360 review screens, and similarly for hierarchies and unmerge, right? And then this endpoint, this process is basically the API endpoint for the ActiveVOS URL. So what I mean with the endpoint is if I go to your ActiveVOS console, and these are the default workflows that are available out of the box, and I go to the MDM workflow project, and say if I go to the one-step approval workflow, which is the process, right, you'll see that this is a service. So this service is the service endpoint that is kind of associated with that particular user, associated with that particular process. So after I have defined the processes associated with a particular trigger, you can again define whether when a create BE event occurs or an update BE event occurs, right? For whether for that particular event you want to kind of enable attachments or comments or not, right? And then here you can associate, right? What whether that sample trigger should kind of start with the create BE or the update BE events. You can kind of associate other events here, which is match BE, merge BE, unmerge, and modify hierarchy, right? So these are the events, and then for what particular users and what particular entities you want that trigger to be associated with. So based on this configuration, the default approval workflow will only be triggered for when a data steward is using a person entity and when that entity is either created or updated. For all the other events, that configuration is not missing, right? But I can go ahead and add that configuration by kind of associating another entity here. So once I go ahead and do this change, it will basically associate both the person and organization entity with a create and or an update BE event. So once we have defined the triggers that we kind of need to trigger, right, the last component is the task administration role, right? So this configuration is pretty simple, right, that you define a role associated in the hub, which can be a custom role as well, to be the task administration role, right? So once this role has been associated with a particular role, a person associated with that role will be able to uh, kind of reassign a task from user 1 to user 2, which was not possible till MDM 10.3. The constraint, however, is that user won't be able to kind of see the task data or kind of execute task actions. Moving on to the next setting, which is not in the task but available under the general settings in the configuration, is a task manager configuration. So this is pretty basic as of now. This kind of like lists the fields that are available in the task manager on the E360 screens. So if I kind of go ahead and try to edit here, right now these are the fields which are kind of associated or available to be included in the task manager. Custom fields are right now not available to be associated in the task manager, right? On the advanced tab, however, one additional functionality we have is that for a particular ORS, if you want to exclude any particular task type to be start showing up in the task manager, then that is something that you can, kind of include or say exclude here from the configuration. For example, here any task which is ActiveVOS BE draft state won't be available in the task manager in the 360 screens. Moving on to the E360 screens, right? So we can quickly, so I'm logged in as data steward 1, which is a user kind of created in the hub console here. So to my E360 screens, like let me quickly try to create an entity here. So if I try to create a test entity here, kind of try to save this, it will prompt me for the task event details or the trigger that has been associated with it, where it will show me, ask me whether I want to include file attachments or comments here, right? A quick update regarding the file attachments, right? So this is something which is controlled by the CMX server properties in the backend. So for reference, right, in CMX server properties, we have this particular property, allowed file extensions to confirm, right, like what particular files can be associated with MDM, right? So docs, XLX, and CSV, any file that you want to kind of get associated with tasks, you can add an entry here, restart MDM, and then kind of get it reflected here, right? So it will allow, I can uh, so this will, the browse button can allow me to associate entities with it. So for now, I will just add a test entity comment, and I'll go ahead and save this. So once this entity is saved, right, we can go to ActiveVOS to have a look at the workflow. you'll see that a one-step approval process has been initiated for that particular entity, right? So as we were discussing earlier, that as part of the create entity workflow, right, one-step approval process is initiated here. This is the start request, which is the entry point of the XML that is, kind of passed on from MDM to ActiveVOS, right? So any details that MDM needs to send to ActiveVOS are kind of part of this particular start request, right? It responds back with process ID back to MDM, and it kind of goes ahead and does some internal mechanisms and halts at the task uh, review process, right? So here, if you look at the process task request, right, this will kind of provide you the details as to what user initiated the hub username, what is the database ID that is associated with that particular task, right? And also the task data, right? Like what particular title were there. The test entity comment is basically appended to the other details associated with those tasks, the interaction ID. So all those task data details, as well as what groups are kind of associated with that role, right? So in our configuration, we have the data steward and the senior manager roles associated with it. So these are the current roles that are the potential owners for these tasks, right? So if you kind of go back here, and you'll see that this is the basically the group of potential owners. So in some scenarios, you might, if the tasks are not showing up and your identity manager test is also successful, you need to kind of verify what users or group of users is actually showing up as the potential owner of this task. The other important thing to notice here is the business administration user, right? So this is the AB admin. So whether this group is will be associated as a business administrator of this process, right? So that is something which can touch a task, reassign the task, but cannot work on the task data. So moving back to the entity 360 screens, right? So if I now So moving back to the Entity 360 screen, so in this session, I'm logged in as an admin user, which is associated with all the other tasks. So if I go and have a look at the task manager. So in this session, I'm logged in as an admin user in the E360 screens, right? So if I click on to my available tasks, right, I'll be able to see the review changes in person, right? So here you can see I'll first need to kind of claim this task as a reviewer. So after the task has been claimed, right, it will be available under my assigned task. So after I kind of select this task, right, these are all the possible actions like approve, reject, and disclaim kind of coming in as the task actions, right? I can even kind of choose to edit this entity, or I can open this entity for doing other operations. Release will basically release the task back in the queue, right? For the purpose of this demo, let me go ahead and try to approve this. So it will basically again open up, right, whether I want to attach file attachment or comment here. So once this has been approved, I will go back to the same process view. So you can see, right, the final review, it basically will kind of follow this particular action in case of a approve, or if it was a reject, it will follow this particular subset of instructions, right? So here the approval process, after it was approved, right, it will kind of get the encrypted security payload here to execute a promote call, which basically will go ahead and try to promote this row ID object in the backend, right? So currently this promote API call is executing. If I do a refresh, I see that the promote call has finished and it has moved on now to a notification task, which is sent back to the data steward role. Moving back to the same E360 screens where the data steward is logged in. So as we move back to the E360 screens and have a look at the DS1 task details, right, we'll see that a new task has kind of come up here. The task type will be notification, which kind of represents that it's a notification task that was generated in the screen. It will have, so if you want to kind of match the task details of the title here, it should match to something here. Review changes in person. So that is how you know that this is the same title for troubleshooting purposes, right? So once you're back in the screens, right, we can have a look at the comments and the workflow. So the comment sections are available to be reviewed. If you go to workflow diagram here, it says that the user does not have permission to view the workflow diagram. So the reason for this is basically a user who only has got the AB admin role on your security realm will be able to kind of view the workflow diagram here in ActiveVOS, right? In MDM, because what happens is that it basically makes a call to ActiveVOS engine, and ActiveVOS basically authenticates that user against the realm again. So if I move on to an admin screen, so now if I look at this record from an admin who is also a data steward, uh, and it has been provided the AB admin role on the ActiveVOS security realm, I will be able to see the same diagram that I was seeing on the ActiveVOS screens here. So now I have moved over to the T admin or the task administration user. If you look into the default screen, which is populated here, right, this seems different than the other business user that we were dealing with. The reason is that for a task administrative user, we provide a grid view, but we can even change this for detailed view, right? But then, as mentioned earlier, the task admin user does not have the capability of viewing any task data or providing any task actions, right? So a user who has only got the AB admin role in the hub, he won't be able to see any tasks, right? But or she will still be able to kind of, provide and do bulk actions. So for bulk actions, he can select 3 tasks and then basically assign it, say, to a data steward, right? So this list of users that comes up it based on the potential owners for the task. So if I choose DS1 here and assign it back, it will be assigned, all the 3 tasks in one go will be assigned to the same user. So I've switched back now to the DS1 user screen and it has got all the 3 new tasks assigned to it. Right. For demonstration purposes, right, it's not just just the task admin user, but any user can perform bulk actions here. So for example, a data steward can edit all the 3 records at once. But then in such a scenario, right, it will kind of show that all the titles are different, right? But he can say test title and update the priority of all these records 3 and say assign the due date here, right? Or assign it to multiple users. I don't want to do that here, but the task type is something because it's different for the 2 task types or the task. He won't be able to edit this. Let me go ahead and save this change. As you can see, all the 3 task title was changed and the priority was changed in the same action. The current 10.4 version is capable of updating up to 100 records at the same time in the same bulk fashion. The other actions that a user can do is bulk assignment of tasks from one user to another, or release or claim, right? So release basically differs in the sense that it will release the task for any user. But if you kind of go and look into the more actions, the disclaim will only be executed by the same user who owns the task. The other thing is if the user wants to execute any more actions, and if they're not of the same type, right, then you will see a message like this, that the selected tasks do not share any common task actions, right? So even though you can change the title and priority and due date for different task types in the same bulk action, but you cannot perform actions like approval or merge. You cannot approve and merge one step approval and a merge task together. So that basically wraps up our demo. We will be sharing some best practices now. So the first one is like the best practices related to upgrade, or the things to note during installation is like the number one is like ActiveVOS does not allow an in-place upgrade, guys. So if you use MDM, right, the MDM installer basically allows an in-place upgrade. But for ActiveVOS, you will actually need to either take a backup of your directory and move it, or during the installation phase, right, you can just provide a different directory name for the ActiveVOS server to be installed. So third-party BPM engines are no longer supported, as mentioned earlier. We do have the concepts of the primary and secondary workflow engine, which can be configured in your workflow manager. The primary tasks are basically kind of created. Sorry, the on the primary workflow engine is the one on which the new tasks are kind of created after you move to ActiveVOS. But you can continue to access your human tasks on the secondary workflow engine as well. But it is still recommended that you kind of recreate the existing tasks on ActiveVOS for ease of maintenance. But if you still want to migrate some of these steps, if you still want to migrate some of these tasks, we do have some migration steps listed in the 10 for migration guide. For clustering, right? So if you're installing ActiveVOS in a cluster, simple HA is not recommended, or simple high availability where you have a couple of nodes deployed on different servers pointing to the same database. So that configuration does not work with ActiveVOS. In ActiveVOS, both the nodes need to be aware about should be aware of about each other, right? So we recommend using a load balancer for ActiveVOS to register with a sticky session. And if you have a couple of nodes or more registered in the ActiveVOS cluster, you can verify them from the ActiveVOS console as well. ActiveVOS also provides an import-export utility if you want to kind of do some server migration. So if you had modified the out of the box work manager threads and other properties on your ActiveVOS server, you can import export these using the utility on ActiveVOS console. So for implementation, right, the concept of MDM orphan task is an important one to understand, right? So MDM as an application kind of generates, or causes the some human tasks to become orphans. It happens when you have a task existing for a merge or create BE for review, and then basically that particular business entity is basically deleted through an external API or by a user, or if user the match records are basically kind of deleted from the match table due to transitive matching, which is inherent to the MDM application, right? So in those scenarios, basically what happens is that the match record or the pending record on the BE, they get basically deleted from MDM, but the task still lingers. So for this, we do have out of the box, sorry, custom utility available through one of our knowledge base articles. You can reach out to Informatica GCS to kind of get this utility. The other recommendations we do have is basically to make sure that the role names for your business users do not have any spaces in MDM, and you do not use hardcode endpoints in your custom beeples as well. You always use URL mappings. right? And then the other change is that if you have been using task intent 3, they need to be claimed going forward. So we do have a best practice guide available for custom workflow. If you're looking for customization, we do have another set of recommendations that you can get from Informatica GCS as well. In terms of performance, the optimum number of tasks that we recommend to have at any time running on ActiveVOS servers between 50 to 70K. Right, so for the merge task, right, we kind of have a couple of CMX server properties that help us throttle the number of tasks, right? So even if you have like a million records present in the match table, right, due to the initial load, we still recommend to create only 50 or 70K tasks in parallel for these. And if you're using a review process or if you're using an external utility to create a review task using the API method, right? We still recommend that you implement a throttling method in your implementation. The next recommendation is related to housekeeping of the ActiveVOS tables. The AE process log data and the AE variable tables are high growth. So we do have mechanisms available in the ActiveVOS console to schedule daily or a scheduled maintenance of removing any completed or faulted task. And then basically you can also do your housekeeping activities with your DBA to kind of move some data from the AE process log data as well. Right. In terms of customization, some things you need to note if you go ahead with customization is that the task metadata cannot be modified after a task ID has been created, right? So as long as a task has not been initiated, you can provide or update details to the ActiveVOS process, right? So that when the task is created or it's in a running state, right, it provides a different set of activities. But after it has been created, right, you cannot modify the metadata of the task. So if you look at the, if you want to go through the out-of-the-box workflows, right? So in case of an approval, rejection, and then a recreation of a task, right? We always create a task with a new ID, right? Even though it is similar, but a new task ID is generated in the backend, right? And similarly, because task metadata cannot be changed for a running process, the potential owners of a running task can also not be changed, right? We do not recommend updating ActiveVOS metadata to reflect data changes, and the fields displayed in the task manager can are based on the presentation parameters, but these can also not be customized. The process deletion, if you do want to do some housekeeping activities, do not delete directly from the database, at least when the application is running. We do recommend to use the terminate API instead. So here's a list of some of the ActiveVOS tables that you can use going forward and the other resources. So I think we are open for QA now.
Hello everyone, please post your questions in the Q&A box and we'll try and answer them. Hi Kunal, we have one question from Raghunathan. The question goes like this: how to trigger workflow from web application?
Yeah, so you can call the create task API to actually kind of create tasks. So what it will do, it will route the data from MDM to ActiveVOS. So the create task API itself calls the start request API for a task. But that is the starting point, right? So you can call the MDM create task API. If you need more detail, you can get the setup details in the provisioning guide, the business entity service guide.
Okay. Next question from Rob. Is it good practice to create tasks using MDM Hub user access?
So, yeah, I mean, if the question is yes, can we create using user exits? You can create it, but whether it's so first thing is that user exits is something which will get deprecated with subject areas. And we have external call concepts coming in going forward with the business entity screens, right? So if I had to implement, I wouldn't implement anything in the user exits. And I think it relates to the previous question where it talks about can we create user exits from an external application, right? So it's like you have a custom code from which you can call the create task API to kind of create new tasks.
Okay.
Next question.
Next question from Santiago. Where does it store physically the attached files on task?
Yeah, so the actual files are stored in the CDPOS attachment table on the MDM side. The file task that is supported is a list which is available in the CMX server properties. So based on the file types, it will store these attachments in the CDPOS attachment table. There's a KB number, I can say it loud, it says 577322, which basically talks about the file attachment. Next question.
Okay. Next question from Plaban. Can you please provide the YouTube link to review the session? Yes, the YouTube link will be available in the Informatica Success Portal. Let me answer that question.
Sure.
Next question is from Roy. Is there or will there be an event trigger whenever a task owner has been changed for a task? Currently, I only know of the approve or reject task event triggers.
So changing of a owner is not a task event. It's basically changing of the potential owner roles which are done using the disclaim or the release button or a claim button by a user. So how it starts with if a new task is created. So there is currently a set of potential owners, which is usually a role like a data steward or a manager or a bunch of users collectively. Based on your configuration, right? So when a user claims a task, it basically is not a task event, it's or a task action. Sorry. Yeah, so a task action is basically whether you approve or reject a task or merge a task. And claim and disclaim are basically for changing of the potential owners. The task events basically comprise of create BE, update BE, merge and merge in hierarchy events.
Okay.
Next question.
Next question from Abhishek. Is it possible to use external LDAP for user management of ActiveVOS users and roles?
Yes, so the ActiveVOS basically relies on the container for its authentication, as well as the authorization for any user who has to log into the ActiveVOS console, right? So how it works is basically on the container, if it is JBoss, WebLogic, you can kind of create a user in the security realm. Now that security realm can be pointing out to LDAP as well. Right, so it will basically pull in the details and it will try to validate the password against the LDAP realm as well. So yes, it will work.
Okay. Next question from Zahid. With MDM 10.4, we are seeing a decryption error when we test connectivity between MDM and ActiveVOS. Have other customers seen these errors?
So I have not seen this issue with any customers till now. I would recommend to either use our MDM and ActiveVOS forum on network, or you can raise a customer case with Informatica GCS for troubleshooting of this issue.
Okay. Next question from Rajiv. How do we decide between user exits and custom tasks using Designer?
Can you repeat that question again? How do we choose between?
How do we decide between user exits and custom tasks using Designer?
Okay. So that question doesn't kind of define the use case, but I'll try to answer the best way I can. So, I mean, from designer, right? I mean, designer basically helps you to modify the out-of-the-box workflows. So by default, MDM provides one-step and two-step approval processes, right? So in case you want to add more functionality, like when should a two-step approval process be called, right? You can, or if you want to create a three-step approval processes, so those are the scenarios where you can call designer. Or say if you have based on like a particular sales region, right? Maybe say for US you want one-step approval, and for non-US you want two-step approval. So those kind of changes and logics can be implemented where it is related to the approval process, right? User exits is something which is only supported with subject areas and basically runs in the backend. So user exits, I think it relates to a previous question as well. So while you're approving the task itself, user exits are not called. The user exits or the external calls are called as part of the the API calls such as promote, pending, or merge as part of MDM. After the record has been approved or it will basically call your user exit. Before that, for your task, user exit codes does not get involved.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Abhishek. Is there any best practice or naming convention guidelines published with respect to ActiveVOS?
So the only one that we recommend is basically try to not have any white spaces in the role names, and then for user logins, we recommend to use all lowercase and not camel case. So other than that, there is no recommendation. I'm not aware of anything on the number of characters, any limitation as such like what it is, but we can find out if we need more details. So you can contact GCS with more details on this.
Okay.
Next question.
Looks like we have answered most of the questions. Please post your questions in the Q&A box. We can wait some more time, Gunnar. Yeah, we've got one question from Lalit. It's a big question. Suppose a user submits a request for approval. Is it possible to route the request to either approval group A or approval group B based on any attribute condition?
So for the attribute condition, you will need to modify your workflows. It cannot just be done with the out-of-the-box workflows as of now.
Okay, there is a second question. Is this a use case for ActiveVOS Designer, or can out-of-the-box one-level workflow can handle based on configuration in task trigger in provisioning tool?
Can you repeat that question?
Is this a use case for ActiveVOS Designer, or can out-of-the-box one-level workflow can handle based on configuration in task trigger in provisioning tool?
Yeah,
it's same question.
I'm not sure. Yeah, so I'm not sure if I get the question, but yes, I mean, whatever you do, so the one-step approval process that is available out of the box, right? It will basically kind of provide the approval, but then anything which is configurable is available as part of provisioning.
Okay.
Yep.
Next question from Rob. In E360, we see task ID. Is this parent process ID or child process ID?
So in the ready task table, it should be the parent process ID.
Okay. Next question. Do you have any KB article on how to clear and regenerate tasks?
Yes, we do have. There is a set of processes that you can, the set of steps that you can follow to clear and regenerate tasks. But when we talk about regeneration of task, we can systematically generate the match task or the merge task, if you call, but not, there is no way to systematically generate one-step approval or two-step approval task, because that is something which is done by the user on an ongoing basis.
Okay.
You can, they can reach out to GCS to get more details on how to clear and regenerate tasks.
Okay. There's another question from Rob again. Is a trial version of ActiveVOS Designer?
So for this, I think you can contact your CSM or salesperson to kind of talk about the licensing. I'm not aware if we do have a trial version, but yes, I mean, somebody from sales or the CSM team for your project can answer that question.
Okay. Another question, will a similar session be held for product 360 workflow management using ActiveVOS in the future?
That is a good suggestion. We can probably take this up internally, Brenda, and then we can align something which is specific for product 360 probably. And ActiveVOS. Yes, that is a good suggestion.
We can do that. Sure, Arjun. We don't have any more questions. Let's wait for some more time. There is one question. User exit will be depreciated in 10.4?
So, okay, so let me give you a brief overview on what we know about. Is basically that user exits work with subject areas, okay, only, and not with the business entity screens. So subject areas are on the radar to be deprecated. What we mean by deprecated is basically that beyond, so in 10.4 they have been marked as for deprecation, right? So what deprecation basically means is that Informatica will not be looking at enhancing subject areas any further, which basically means if there is any request for any functionality change or any big requirements, right, we won't be kind of taking those up. But yes, we will continue to support user exits in subject areas as a whole. But we, kind of ask our customers to move or plan to move to the entity 360 screen. So which basically means is that if you are implementing new projects, right, or new screens, then you basically utilize entity 360 screens going forward instead of subject areas. And if you're already using subject areas, you basically plan on migrating subject area screens as well as the underneath user exits. So the user exits are getting deprecated along with the subject areas. For the hub, as of now, there's no plan to deprecate it.
Okay. Looks like we have answered most of the questions, Kunal. If ever we have failed to answer any of your questions, we'll get back to you offline after this presentation. Thanks for joining this call. Hope everyone is safe at this point. Thanks all the presenters for for spending some time for this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you guys. Bye.